All 80 of these are now cut off their sprues and cleaned up, so the next step is going to be to fold them on that little crease line that's been etched in there so that you have a right angle plate. And then after that I'll attach them to the top and the bottom of each of the columns in their associated locations. Just like we did with the shoe, I take each one of these little brackets and I put any flat steel will work, but the file, I find the file handy. I just put the file across there, that little score mark there, that is the fold, and I put this flat chisel blade just underneath and up, and it makes a perfect right angle bracket. Next one, same thing, lay it across there in the joint, blade underneath, lift up, and again another one. So that's 10 down and 70 more to go. Once the brackets are folded into 90 degrees, I make sure go through them all, tweak them to make sure that they're all as close to 90 as possible. And one edge has to be slightly file flush with the end rivet that's right on here. And you can see there's lefts and rights because this is how they'll end up going on the back of the beam, those vertical columns. So what we'll do now is sort those out and glue them onto the backs. Now the joist beams have now been set in place on the vertical beams, and there's a little notch right there that sits against. I have to use a square, and that's what I do, is I just put a square up against the post and then move the beam up against it as I put some ACC on the end of it, and then go from that one to the next and so on. And you can see all the beams are now in place, and the trick now will be, of course, to assemble the other side. I have to take this and bring it over and set it on top of all these joists here and keep them all square. So what I'm probably going to have to do is I'm going to put a similar piece of support. I'll probably take a piece of timber, and I'll use something, like this. I'll cut it to length, and I'll set it on this end and on this side, just to support the eye bars along here, and so that it doesn't collapse down when I'm setting it in place. I'm going to try that, and if the other alternative is to turn this over on its back, and I have to put some weight on it so it stays like so, and I'll try that as well. And I think that's probably going to be the way to do this. Bring the other cord over on the side and bring them together, and that way I'm going to be able to keep everything square and plumb. I decided to use that jig that I'd made before for the cords to go in through here. And so what I've done now is I've placed the cord against these stops here, generally lining it up on the plan, but that's not that relevant. And then I've glued another block on the other side to hold that cord tightly in place in a new channel. Jigs are very handy. They keep everything in alignment. So what I've done by putting in these blocks in here. I've put some temporary supports on the underside here just to keep this from tipping over, and I'll put a weight on here in a few minutes that'll hold the cord flat. I've got an assortment of iron bars that I've had for years, which are kind of handy, so I'll end up putting those on there, and that'll hold it dead flat as I start to build up the other cord that goes down the side here. Now, the other thing that's important is to have these square. So what I did is I put another piece of wood, this is just 12 by 12 stock, on the end, flush with the end of this, and square to the jig. So when I put the other cord in here, it'll butt against this, so I will have the two sides square to each other. I need to determine the width between these two posts which is really the base, and it'll be exactly the same as it is on the bottom, the length of that joist. So what I've done is I've measured with calipers from the last row of rivets here to the last row of rivets there, leaving a space in here which has got a pin going through later on, and that's exactly where this I-beam is going to go. So I've used my calipers to determine the dimension across here by making a piece of wood, cutting it to length, basically the same size as the space at the bottom, and by bringing it up here and putting it between these two legs here and below the brackets, I get an equal space, and that's how I get this dimension here with the calipers. As I said earlier, I'm replacing the styrene that is supplied because I felt that the styrene was just way too flexible and didn't have the strength across here to avoid any twisting. So I purchased 12-inch lengths of brass, 1/8-inch brass I-beams, and using my calipers, I mark off the length of each one, make a mark, and I cut that off with a cutting disc, and then I just slightly oversized, then I put it on the grinder and I just flush the end off, bringing it down to the exact length. And then what I do is I take and I put that spacer in between these posts and put a rubber band around. I think a clamp further back is going to kind of probably be a little too heavy, but I use a rubber band to tie these, to pull these together with the spacer here, and then put some ACC in these two channels here, these shoes, and then once I get the adhesive in there, I take my tweezers, once the ACC's in there, and I position the beam in there and then just clamp it momentarily until the ACC sets, and once it does that, I'll do the same thing on this side, put the ACC in there and then close it up, pinching it tight. And now we're starting to get a very rigid structure here, and the flexibility this way will be made very rigid once we get the diagonal bracing in here with the rods. But laterally this is absolutely rigid, and there's no twist in it this way. I took one of the steel bars that come with the kit and I've placed it along the side of the columns from one end to the other and clamped them together, because I found that many of these columns were not exactly perpendicular and in line, and in so doing I'm hoping that when everything is installed with the I-beams and the diagonal bracing, that will hold them all in line and plumb. Now what I've also done is I've completed installing the I-beams in brass in the shoes. It's a little tricky holding everything together, but the first thing I did was I put the I-beam in here with a little bit of ACC on the end of it. Using the tweezers I clamped this one until it held in place, and then once it was set I then moved to this one here and I put in the ACC on the top and bottom and adjusted this to the position, clamped that like so until it was cured, and then released it, and now we have all the I-beams in place. The next thing we're going to do is start putting in the diagonal bracing between the bottom and the top of each post, using those shoes that we installed earlier, top and bottom. And now what we have to do is cut and shape diagonal bars with eyes on the ends of them, so they go into those shoes, and then pin them. Well, now at the stage where we have to install a diagonal brace from the shoe down here to the shoe up on the underside of this I-beam. It needs a loop at each end so that it goes around and then through a pin that goes through in here, and we'll pin it at the top, and then another diagonal brace the other way. We'll do each one of these.